Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on leading change. My name is Carol Newman, and I'm the Director of Learning at Vantage. I'm really excited today to welcome members of Gymnastics BC to this webinar, where we're going to be exploring some really cutting-edge concepts and models on how to lead change, and then to take a look at some of the practical applications of how to make change happen successfully within your organization. A little bit about me. I've been with Vantage for the last 2 years, and before that I was an executive director of a provincial advocacy group in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm really excited to be joined today for the beginning of our webinar by Mark Friesen, who is our consulting manager here at Vantage. And Mark has an interesting background as well, and one that is directly connected into the gymnastics world. So I'll let Mark take a moment and introduce his background to everyone.
Yeah, just quickly, I've also been with Vantage 2 years. Prior to that, at SFU, doing a master's in urban studies with a focus on governance, and before that, executive director at Delta Gymnastics. So I'll be sharing a couple of examples related to my time at Delta Gymnastics, but also with some of the groups that we work with here at Vantage.
Thank you so much, Mark. So we're really looking to answer 4 high-level but very key questions about leading change. The first is the big picture of what makes change work. What can we learn from change? What do leaders do during change to make it successful? Then we'll start exploring the model that will get us through major change. And that focuses first on how we can get other people excited and motivated and participating in change. Then we'll look at what makes change succeed over the long run by exploring some of the key differences between change and transition. And we'll conclude by exploring some different ways that you can find opportunities to practice change leadership in your organization. So I'll turn it over to Mark. Mark, when you think about your experience leading change, how would you define it? What words come to mind for you?
Yeah, when I saw this and was preparing for this, and I saw this slide, the first kind of phrase or word that came to my mind was time-consuming. Especially if it's significant change, takes a lot of, it takes a lot of time to include everybody who needs to be included and to have some of the discussions and to do the preparation work that's required. So yeah, that was the main thing for me, was time-consuming. Mm-hmm. What Anita's put here, resistance and excitement.
Yes. Yes, and it's funny how those can sometimes go hand in hand, right? You might be working with a large team or even a small team, and you'll have both of those emotions really front and center within different people or at different points in that change process. One thing that I notice in my experience in leading change is the need for perseverance. So really focusing on the follow-through and giving people a reasonable and realistic timeline on what they can experience when. Change is really more of a process than an event, and so that sometimes gets lost. You know, you can get really excited about the beginning of change, right? Those first few transitions that happen, but change can take a long time to really take hold, and getting people committed to that and aware of that, I think, is really key. Managing expectations, Anita contributed that, and that's absolutely imperative. So that starts at the beginning and has to be managed all the way through the change process. So I think Mark has a story about that, about how do you manage expectations realistically when maybe some of the parameters around change are fluid and might shift as well.
Well, and the resistance piece is actually a little bit perfect, because Carol's going to get into some of this, a model that is pretty useful for mitigating that, or helping a team of people move forward and decrease, I guess, the resistance. And so I've been asked to share some stories along these lines. The first one I've got is, and some of you may be familiar with this, at Delta Gymnastics a couple of years ago, we're moving into brand new facility, the Delta Sport Development Center. One of the most important reasons why we needed a new gym at the time was so that competitive athletes and recreational athletes could train at the same time. And that was a pretty clear vision. That was a pretty clear goal. That was a pretty clear reason why the new expanded center was necessary, and the old center was not possible. So you had some times of the week when the competitive athletes were training and other times when only recreational athletes could train, and never two at the same time. So when it came time to figure out and do the layout for where equipment was going to go, it very quickly, you can imagine the tensions that arose and a lot of resistance, differences of opinion, you can imagine, between heads of the rec program, heads of the preschool program, and heads of both the men's and women's artistic program, and then also some interest in the trampoline program. So I'm sure this resonates with many of you today. But being clear, the clarity that was almost kind of by accident, but that we had put in place, it was a recognition that no, the new center was so that all programs could run at the same time, and so that stewarded a lot of those organizations forward, or conversations, pardon me, forward. And move the group towards agreement to recognize that, yeah, you know what, this gym is not just for competitive athletes, and vice versa, it's not just for recreational athletes, and if it is for both those programs to run, and preschool as well, at the same time, then that moved the place in a certain direction. So that's going to come up later on in this model. There's a distinction Carol's going to get into between change management and change leadership, and the critical one of the critical pieces to change leadership is starting with a clear goal or vision or an articulation of why the change is needed, and so that was clear in that case, and so helped us move forward.
Well, thanks, Mark. That was really interesting to hear about. Because what happens oftentimes with change is that it really reveals maybe different understandings of what it is that we're here to do, who it is we're here to serve, and how we can do that best. So conflict comes up a lot in change. Wouldn't you say from your experience?
Yeah, and the conflict, I think, especially in that case, and in other cases where things have not worked out so well, that got one story along those lines in a moment, but in the absence of a goal or a clear vision that the group has spent time talking about, and that's the critical piece, and why I think time is a big factor, then you'll have more conflict. And so getting around the resistance piece, I think, is building in time to clarify that vision or goal.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so you have another story for us, I hear.
Well, the other one, and again, this will relate to some of the concepts that you're going to go through later, Carol, but it relates also to the Delta Sport Development Center and the fundraising effort we did out in the community. So, I mean, it was a new facility for Delta Gymnastics. So it was going to be a gymnastics facility, but we really needed to get community support, not only for the facility itself, but also community support to fundraise. We wanted to go beyond our base of volunteer parents to do the fundraising for the new center, and so wanted to get prominent, community leaders from different groups, different sectors to help out. We also wanted recognition for the fact that, for us, gymnastics is, a foundational tool to build athletes overall, and so our way to try to get at that was through the name Delta Sport Development Center, so a title for the center with no mention of the name gymnastics. Unfortunately, the part of this story that did not work out so well is, although we had the name in place of the center, we didn't really articulate in a clear, single way a really strong vision for what exactly that meant. We kind of scratched at it, and that was, I think, clear for those of us who were coaches and stuff like that. That was very clear. But there were times with the committee of fundraisers from the community where there are interesting proposals for, hey, if this is a sport development center, why don't we do a second-level running deck? Why don't we put in a batting cage? All sorts of interesting ideas related to sport, and because there was it led to some conflict, not outright conflict, but difficult conversations and they were difficult because we hadn't articulated, well, no, we're calling this Delta Sport Development Center, but it's still gymnastics. And we hadn't really made that in some cases crystal clear to everybody involved in the effort, other than this name Delta Sport Development Center, which said nothing about the word gymnastics. If we had done that, if we said, well, yeah, we're calling it this, but here's what the vision is. It's a place to build, physical movement skills, young kids using gymnastics, if we'd been really clear, and like I say, some of us were very clear with that, but there was a broad team of community members, and we didn't really put that on paper anywhere at any point, and that made for some challenging conversations.
So where did the resistance come from, or how did you get people, and as the second part, how did you get people on side?
Well, so what happened in terms of the resistance, it was people, when we would say, well, no, we don't really want to look at doing a second level running track, for instance, or actually the other idea that came forward was, putting in bleachers for people to spectate and view, gymnastics or run large events there. There was an impression with some folks that had those ideas that, well, they just didn't like my idea, right? And so they got frustrated because it became personal. It became Mark's opinion, like my opinion, or some other coach's opinion versus another person, rather than a conversation around, well, what's the goal for the center? If the goal is this, then okay, I understand why you may not support that idea. Without that, it becomes my opinion versus yours, and not a very effective place to have a productive conversation. So we actually turned and leaned on some of the language around physical literacy and foundational movement and gymnastics as a foundational sport, and that's what we meant. And so we were able to clarify that. But if we had done that proactively, I think we could have had some easier conversations with a lot of community supporters that were involved.
Okay, so what really worked from what I'm hearing is making it depersonal, looking at some outside expertise and research on, some of the choices that you were making. But rolling the tape back, you mentioned wanting to do that more proactively. Is there any other things that, maybe advice that you would give your former self or former team in terms of what you might do differently?
Well, the one thing is that it sounds a little bit cliche, I guess, but would be saying, once we identified the name, Delta Sport Development Center, articulating what the vision for that, a strong vision for that center, to say, here's what we're going to call it, and here's what it's all about in a clear, concise statement, and to kind of force everybody involved to use that statement so that it was front and center for those of us, for those in the community who weren't kind of insiders to the gymnastics world, who maybe, like I say, it was pretty clear for coaches and those of us who were, staff or board members of Delta Gymnastics, but for that broader community, putting in place a compelling vision and forcing everybody to use that, I think, would have been valuable.
That's awesome. So that reminds me of one of the old adages about change, and it's called the change equation. And basically, it says that in order to overcome resistance, you need a combination of three things. You need a really clear dissatisfaction. You need to be make sure that people are clear about what's not working now. Create a clear vision on a better future and getting people excited about that. And then you need to give them some concrete next steps about how we're going to get there together. And that's really what's critical around overcoming resistance to change. And it's easy to forget one or more of those steps. But, if you have them all in place and you have them connected to each other, it can be incredibly powerful.
And that, I'd like to pick up on that note about dissatisfaction. There, you should only really contemplate, and the type of changing we're talking about here is when there's a clear necessity, right? There's some reason why the change is a good idea, and oftentimes people skip over that and gloss over that, and they go right into, okay, what change is required? But you need, in terms of getting at this resistance piece that's come up, you absolutely need to talk with the team and clarify, okay, what are we dissatisfied with, and nail it down and make sure that there is, not to assume that everyone understands why or that change is necessary, but saying, okay, what's not working? And or to start the conversation with, okay, is this working? And hopefully we're getting everybody involved to acknowledge that, this is not really working so well and it could be better. And if you can spend time there, then any kind of change effort will move much more quickly and be far less conflictual than what typically happens, where one or two people acknowledge the need for change and launch forward into the change and sort of communicate in a haphazard way that, yeah, we need some change because, we're here and we need to move forward. And one example I've got is a group we were working with that has been running for a long time, over 3 decades. So this is a 30-year-old organization, and they've grown absolutely exponentially in the last decade, growing from 4 to 5 staff now to over 30. They've never, in that period of growth, they've never really created a very clear organizational, or had never created a very clear organizational structure. And so there were lots of tensions arising, and lots of blame going around why things were difficult, why miscommunications were happening, conflicts of personality, a whole bunch of difficulties. So, and there was a couple people that thought, there was really two opinions. One was that, all the blame lies on the person who's kind of heading or stewarding the organization. The other sort of camp was of the perception that we really need to clarify roles and responsibilities and do a bit of delegation, like delegate responsibility areas to staff, because they were bigger now. It could not be in a situation where one person knew and was in charge of everything. It was simply not feasible for that to be the case anymore. But only a couple of people had those opinions. Others were just confused, and there was a whole myriad of other excuses or reasons given for why things were difficult. We needed to spend about 3 hours in a session sort of acknowledging why and how what was going wrong. And so it wasn't even talking about how to move forward. It was just acknowledging where they were at and what was difficult. And what that achieved was getting everyone to acknowledge that, yes, something was wrong, and everyone through that process agreed that, yes, the best place to start is addressing the organizational structure. And so doing a bit of restructuring and acknowledging that, yeah, we're here not because it's anybody's fault, but because we've grown exponentially and we've got all these staff positions, but we're still running as though we're a 5-person operation. And to an outsider or to one individual in the organization, it was, a simple solution. But we needed to talk that out for like 3 hours for the entire group to get complete ownership and complete commitment to, yes, this is the type of change that was required. Once they got that, they then moved very quickly to doing the organizational restructuring. Whereas if you can imagine a converse situation is, if one or two people had decided, okay, yeah, this is the change that's needed, so here's the new org chart, then you can imagine months of conflict around, well, why is this necessary? Well, I disagree with where that person's been put, or I disagree with how this has been rolled out, or who's in charge of this whole process. Instead, because this group spent time acknowledging and clarifying that, yes, there was dissatisfaction and change was necessary, once they did agree on that and what the problem was, they then moved very quickly through a restructuring process.
That's a great example, and it reminds me of this saying, sometimes you have to go slow if you want to go fast. And investing that time at the beginning can feel maybe like it's not the best use of resources, or that it's opening up, some difficult conversations, conflict. It could feel like you're opening up Pandora's box, but getting it all out there can really help people just be really honest with it and unpack some of those assumptions that they might have about how things are actually functioning, and whether or not we really need to do anything differently.
Absolutely, and what you just said, Carol, that piece, another facilitator that we work with put it to me in these words. He said, process is more important than speed. And if there's nothing else, I think you should all write that down right now, because that's a really good, or write down the way Carol just phrased that, because that's so important. I think especially when it comes to changes, the process is far more important than the speed at which it happens, because precisely that, you'll save time by spending time.
Yeah, exactly. And one theme that you'll hear a lot throughout the webinar today is that change is really not about the technical steps. It's really about people. And it succeeds or fails based on how you engage with your people, not on how well you, design your change management process. It's really about, it's an exercise in listening, it's an exercise in communication, and in persistence. And so we'll talk more about that over the coming hour. So I wanted to thank you, Mark. I know you have to step out right now, but that was a couple of incredibly vivid examples on what makes change work, what do we need to be mindful of, and how can we move forward together as a team. So
thank you, Carol. It was fun, and good luck to everyone with your change leadership efforts.
Maybe as Anita's typing things out, I'll share an example that I experienced at an organization that I was a board member of.
And this organization was making some changes to their organizational structure. So being a board that had a lot of members at large to a board that had a lot more specific roles. And so it was a pretty big shift in organizational culture, and it was a really long-term strategy. So the pivot wasn't going to happen, let's say, over a month or two. It was an 18-month change that they were looking to make this happen. So the timeline was quite long. And what they ended up doing, the leaders took a lot of time at the beginning to bring in outside facilitators who were able to unpack all of the ideas that were out there, all of the possibilities on what a new structure could look like, and spend a lot of time just fleshing out different possibilities and making sure that everyone felt very, very heard. So people felt like there was an opportunity to maybe articulate what wasn't working right now, but also bring to front and center some of the new ideas on what might work. And with all of that out there, it felt like there were different agendas maybe at play or different visions, and it was a time of a lot of change within the organization. Some people felt like they weren't sure or they weren't that invested in making the change, so they decided to leave the board. But most people stayed, and they were able to contribute to other people's ideas, look for some of the connections or similarities between different models that were put out there, and work together to pick some and design really some new strategies on how the board could work more effectively together. And so thinking again about that 18-month strategy, probably about 6 or 7 months was just having conversations and looking at different models, doing research on what else was out there, and having the facilitator guide us through it. And so the leaders, I think what really made this change successful was patience and collaboration. So it wasn't them imposing a new structure. They didn't bring the research to the table saying, I've looked at different models, this is the one I would recommend. It was a slow process, and it was a really engaging process. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Anita, and I'm going to read out her responses because she has a lot of great insight here. So she's sharing an example from her club, Okanagan Gymnastics, where they changed their organizational chart from one head coach to head coaches for each discipline, which took a lot of work prior and is now working very well. So there was a lot of resistance at first, she says, and then the value was seen going forward. So it took about 6 months to work through everything. So speaking to all of the staff and coaches to see what was working and what was not working was really key in terms of what the leaders did to support it. So that's a really terrific example, and I think one that a lot of clubs would get benefit from and think about. So Anita, a question that I would have for you is, were you able to identify what wasn't working in a way that didn't feel personal? What made that work for you? So Anita shared a really interesting strategy, and that's having individual meetings with those key staff and providing some level of confidence or confidentiality around it. And that's really great, because sometimes, if things are really sensitive or it feels like there's maybe a vested interest, you don't want to have your ideas put in front of a room full of people. It might be easier to do that one-on-one. So individual meetings can be really helpful. I've also seen organizations use online tools where the data is collected anonymously as a way of let's say putting forward a survey or just asking open-ended questions. So there are a lot of ways of getting to the same result in that way. So thanks so much for that, Anita. I'll ask Brittany and Vanessa as well, either within the organization right now or in another experience. Can you give us an example of change that was done well and share what the leaders did in that organization to support it? Okay, awesome. And so Vanessa has shared that she's found that involving every layer of the organization, identifying and communicating with key stakeholders was key. And that's so important because sometimes that really gets missed. And later on in the webinar, we're going to look at a really brief case study that missed that key step. And so change needs to happen at every level and engage everyone. So if you're an organization that works with, let's say, a lot of programs, you're interacting with parents, making sure that you're involving your frontline staff can be the key to successful change because they have their ear to the ground when it comes to where your key stakeholders are. One of the things that sort of struck me when we look at change and how we think about change is this shift from a perspective of change management to change leadership. And so what I mean by this is really focusing less on all of the technical elements and more on the people. And so we're still attending to process, we're still focusing on that, thinking it through, designing change in a way that makes sense for our organizational needs, but making sure that at every step of the game, we are baking people into the process. So we're starting with people, we're bringing people through, and at the end of it, we're thinking about our people as well. So in the literature and all of the models, you'll see this older example that's sort of been dying out where the focus on change management was really about controlling change. It was reactive. It was about the processes. It was about the benefit to the organization, maybe only in dollars and cents, and not necessarily on, let's say, the impact or the engagement or the member experience or the experience of people who are in programs that we deliver. And so leading others, and I would say that is really a key element here, and I'll just highlight that. So this part right here, when we're looking at leading others, really frames it as overcoming resistance. And I want to highlight that because that was really the fundamental piece of every change management model for a very long time. Change is all about getting other people to buy into the vision that you've created for them. And now I would say that the focus is a lot different, right? It's really about connecting with values and encouraging participation. And that happens at the beginning of the change process, but it happens as an ongoing process. So whether it's really a formal way of looking at the input of your members or your input of your stakeholders, or it's maybe looking back to gather some insight from, let's say, here at Vantage Point, we look at surveys, and we take a lot of value on our surveys of people participating in our labs and people participating in workshops and our custom engagements, and listen to that and try and use that as a motivation for change. So we're always adapting and changing and starting from a place not of our own assumption or vision, but of listening first, so listening before we're speaking. And so the goal there might still have a motivation around making sure that we're using our resources wisely, but the big picture is really about empowering other people in the organization to embrace change in order to deliver on the mission more effectively. So this is something that you'll see in the workbook that we're sending out after the webinar, but it's a subtle shift that'll come up and become, I think, a lot more clear as we move forward throughout the day here, because it really is so key to be able to figure out where is it that we're at and where are the people that we serve at, right? Because they can be sometimes really different. Okay. So the model that we're using now, and the one that is most common out there when it comes to leading change, is called AdCar. And so it speaks to 5 key elements, people-focused elements around change. The first one is awareness. And so these are the things that leaders really need to do in order to make change happen successfully. They need awareness and to create awareness across the organization about the need to change. Then to articulate the desire to participate and support the change, knowledge of how to change and what that change looks like. So from a leader's perspective, it's about not only having that knowledge, but sharing that knowledge within the team so that everyone feels connected to the change and able to make the change on their own in their own roles. Ability to implement the change on a day-to-day basis, and then reinforcement to keep that change in place. So these steps are laid out in a logical and sequential order. So you need to have an awareness of the need to change before you can have, let's say, a focus on the ability or reinforcement pieces. So we start with that and then move forward through it. And so as we get through this model, we'll get to a place where we're talking more about not only reinforcement, but transition. So what happens internally when people are going through change? What is that happening for them on a psychological level and in terms of their own performance, right? When you look to their behaviors, how they're able to fulfill their job duties as they're undergoing change, there are certain things that leaders need to pay attention to and really have frank and open conversations about with people in order to make sure that that change is happening smoothly and in a way that keeps the team connected and cohesive. So we're going to break it out and look at some of these elements in groups so that we're not getting overwhelmed, but seeing the connections here. So we'll start with awareness and desire. And those are the first two elements of this AdCar model. So within awareness, we start with a focus on discovering what is working and what is not working. And we do that through listening and we do that through conversation and then communicating the case for change from that. So earlier I spoke to the change equation and this really speaks to this again very directly. So when we're thinking about change, we're starting from a place of why change is necessary at this moment in time, what the change is there to accomplish, and getting people really clear on the vision for the future, why things will be better after the change, and some next steps. So they may not want to know everything that needs to happen, but knowing that there's a way for them to start moving forward is really imperative. So I want to also think about some of the questions that you might want to ask yourselves as leaders about change as it relates to awareness and desire. So how do you know when change is required and where does the inspiration come from? That can be really tough. And so when you think about the spark for change, it might be something really straightforward, like let's say a strategic planning exercise. That's a great opportunity for change because you're doing a lot of the activities that would lead to change management and change leadership. So for example, when you're undertaking a strategic planning exercise, you're doing a lot of stakeholder engagement. You're reviewing some of your performance measures and results. You're taking a hard look at your organizational priorities and your programs. And so that's a really ripe time to think about some big picture change and ask yourself, you know, are the things that we're doing really effective? Are they getting us to where we want to go? Or is something maybe in the external environment change that we need to respond to? So it could be that there are more competitors in your local marketplace for some of the programs and services that you're delivering. It could be that there's a big funding change that's happened, and that's something that you need to take into consideration when you're delivering your objectives for your organization. But change doesn't always have to wait until the next strategic plan. Change can happen in the day-to-day. It might happen when there's, let's say, a leadership change as well. So when there's a significant renewal of board members on your board, that can bring a lot of new ideas into the organization as well. And so change can be a place where you're working with an abundance of opportunities. And so that is always a really positive positive thing to work with, because when you think about where change comes from, sometimes it can feel like it's always about overcoming deficits or overcoming scarcity. We need to change because we don't have enough funding, or we don't have enough interest, or we don't have enough support. But when new people are coming into the organization that have ideas, being able to open the door to experimentation in a safe way can be really positive, because it gives people the opportunity to feel really engaged, to test out some new strategies and to see if they work. So for example, here at Vantage Point, we had a new executive director join our team about 3 years ago, and with that came a lot of renewal in terms of the staff, in terms of the board, and in terms of the strategies. And so we took a really deep look at the organization's key programs and services and started experimenting with them and taking some risks with what we do and how we did it. And we learned a lot in that process and really embraced the ability to take some risks with new ideas, and really encourage everybody on the team, both the board, the staff, and volunteers, to bring ideas forward and to try out and see what's working, but to also make sure that we're making the case for change when we're doing that. We're thinking things through and ensuring that a new program or service is going to align with our big picture organizational goals, but also, we're getting back to the principles of fixing things, right? A new idea, whether it's a new process, a new program, a new marketing strategy, is there to solve a problem. And with that, we're a pretty dynamic team, but we're working with change from a place of thinking about our customers first. Okay. So this is something that you may want to reflect on more with your individual teams. Where do you find change is required? What is the inspiration from that? And where does change come from in terms of, thinking about the last 2 or 3 major changes in your organization? Did it come from the board? Did it come from stakeholders? Did it come from the team? Did it come from, let's say, a new report in your community that prompted the ability or need for change? It can come from many places. So it might be useful to take that back to your organization and have more conversation about it. Now I'd like to turn it back to you and get us to think about the desire for change. And this is a complement to awareness. So once you know that you want to change, how do you get people motivated towards it? How do you get people excited about making change happen? And what tactics can you use to make sure that change involves your whole team? So again, I turn things over to you just to brainstorm, quick ideas on making change happen in your organization. So anyone who wants to type in quickly, I would encourage you to do so. Awesome. So Vanessa submitted, having a clear vision is really key. Absolutely. Getting people excited about the future is such a great motivator and creates urgency. When you see something great out there, you work towards it, you drive and want to get there quickly. And another idea from Vanessa is having key indicators for success. Absolutely. So if you know what success looks like in terms of those hard numbers, or knowing that you're getting there, wow, can that be powerful. I've seen organizations use things like dashboards so that they know how close they're getting to some of their goals. They'll put that on their website or in their annual report and use it internally as well as a way to stay motivated and connected to change. That's terrific. Another tactic that I've seen used sometimes with change is doing post-mortems on major events or major programs. So doing some reflection and debrief around something that's really big. So figuring out, what is it that worked with our new strategy, or maybe it's a long-standing event that we've delivered, and where are the opportunities for trying something new? And sometimes kindling that fire, that spark of inspiration for something that's a little bit different, can come out of, maybe something that you do frequently. It can be maybe some feedback that you got at your major fundraising event, someone brought forward to you. So focusing on that and really, again, focusing on creating the vision, communicating it, but also doing the listening. So the other side of it is really about engaging other people and focusing on bringing those ideas forward. Clear communication is something Brittany touches on as well, and implementing change in stages. Yeah, that is terrific because it can feel really overwhelming maybe if you're looking at the change all at once. People can kind of feel like they're getting lost in it. It's hard for them to imagine what will be different in their day-to-day when they're looking at something that maybe is a really long-term change strategy. I'll share something from Vantage Point that we recently undertook. So we were doing our operational planning for 2017 throughout the month of August, and one of the elements that we did when we were looking at new programs was to have a few brainstorming sessions. And so we got everyone on the team who wanted to participate to come together and submit ideas for new programs. And from there, we worked through a quick 10-question worksheet in order to test out the viability of these different programs. So everyone had the opportunity to come up with a new strategy, and then as a team we made sure that we were thinking things through, and then spent some time the other day doing some prioritization based on that, and we were able to come up with 4 new workshops for 2017. So it was a really involved process, but I think what the key to making it successful was creating that invitation to participate and making that really clear, both in terms of what was expected of people and what they could expect from the process. So it wasn't necessarily an opportunity for everyone to come and submit an idea that we would definitely move forward with, right? But it was an opportunity to come and submit an idea that together we would explore. And I think that's something that we're starting to see some benefit from. Moving to a place where we're together thinking about risk, we're thinking about opportunity, and getting insight from everybody on the team. So that was really helpful. So communication and collaboration really go hand in hand when it comes to creating that sense of urgency and participation. So now that we've explored a little bit about awareness and desire, we can move on to knowledge and ability. And so here we're getting more into some of the key elements of moving forward. So building out the project team and targets, designing the process, and then implementing change with more support over time. So oftentimes I would say in some of the older ways that we thought about change, this is where we would start. We would start by building the project team, setting the targets, designing the change process, outlining, let's say, budgets or key stakeholders, what the requirements would be from different elements of the organization, and what our goals were, rather than starting slow and starting with building awareness, building desire, and building momentum on the team. So knowledge and ability, it can be really tempting to want to move there really quickly, but it takes some patience and some skill to know that you go slow first and spend as much time as you possibly can within awareness and desire before you move on to knowledge and ability. So we'll look at some of the key elements that you need to think about within your own organizational context for the knowledge and ability piece, because it really will depend so much on how your team works together, what this looks like. So I have a quote on screen here from an author who writes a lot about learning organizations, and he says that transformation requires constant learning and growth. So a learning organization is dedicated to continually enhancing its ability to create its desired future. So, you can think about this maybe if you want to take it back to your organization and reflect on, does it reflect the organization that you're working on with? What would make you think that it does, and how can you move your organization more towards being a learning organization? And why is this important when it comes to change? I think the shift that I would say is that organizational change is a constant. If it doesn't happen because we plan it, then it'll happen because it is coming from one of the many impetuses for change, whether it's a changing external environment, changing stakeholders, changing funding requirements, changing expectations, changes in the organization. Change is something that we live with and are steeped in. We're not going to get away from change. So there's an opportunity for us to make a choice, to either be really intentional about change and embrace it, or to let change happen to us and to our organizations. So what Peter Senge is saying is it's better for us to embrace it and to realize that there's an opportunity to always be listening and learning and growing and communicating and collaborating. And with that, it is, I think, really empowering because it shifts our expectations of change away from this need to have change be perfect and towards a place where we can think about change being iterative. You know, we're going to learn, we're going to experiment, we're going to get things as right as possible, and then we're going to reflect and learn some more and make some more tweaks. So we're always going to be growing, we're always going to be learning, we're always going to be adjusting, and we're never going to have it exactly perfect, and that's okay. Because as much as we can, we're going to bring other people along with us in that learning journey and have them be part of the process of experimentation and reflection. And so with that, change becomes something that you can get excited about, right? Because change is owned by the whole team. It's owned across the organization. And it's a win-win situation rather than a win-lose situation. Another way of contextualizing change in your organization is to do some reflection on where you might be in your organizational life cycle. And by that, I really mean thinking about where your organization is in terms of different elements, those key elements that make up your organization, right? Your programs, your day-to-day management, your governance and leadership, so the leadership from your senior staff person and from your board, and to think about as well your resources and administrative systems. And when we use a model like this, a graph like this, what we frequently see is organizations have more resources dedicated to their programs than they do any other element within their organization. So if you kind of plot it out as this graph does, from being very new and idea focused on the left side of the chart to being sort of more mature as you move through to the middle, and then tapering off into decline or turnaround or an ending phase at the right-hand side of it, most frequently organizations will see that their programs, what they spend their time developing and delivering, are the closest to maturity or that sort of operational efficiency and excellence. That's where you have most of your staff, most of your resources, most of your focus, most of your funding. And in other areas, maybe you're not where you are, where you'd like to be in terms of your efficiency and effectiveness. So that matters when it comes to how we design our change. So when you're thinking about change being people-focused, where are your governance systems and how does that play into your change? So if your board, let's say, doesn't meet very frequently and they're not as focused on looking towards the mission of the organization, it might be difficult or challenging for them to really get on side or feel as involved with maybe making some of the big picture changes that are required for the organization to remain viable and sustainable and effective. So what do you need to keep in mind, and or how do you need to involve your board if that's the case? If you're undertaking a major change in your organization, it would also have an impact on your administrative systems and your financial resources. So it's important to think that through and involve the people who are responsible for those areas to identify, what will this require of those systems and resources, or what might you have to do differently? Would you have to perhaps adjust some of your timelines in order for that to be accommodated? In your workbook, you'll see an example of a change that happened within a few branches of the Canadian Mental Health Association. So a few years ago, the 3 branches in the Lower Mainland area merged. And when that happened, it created some hiccups around the administrative side of things because there were suddenly 3 year-end processes to deal with and 3 sets of books that had to be amalgamated into one. So if you're undertaking a big change, make sure that you're thinking about some of the detail around what will be different and involving the people responsible for that as well. So thinking again about the big picture, what is it that we want to gain from looking at a model like this and thinking about our organizational life cycle, it's really that different elements of your organization might be in different places. And the more that you can focus on bringing together people who represent those different elements of your organization and having that honest, depersonalized conversation about it, the better off you will be. So a takeaway for you, and you'll see this in the workbook that we'll send on, is that we have an organizational life cycle table, so you can review that, identify which life cycle or elements of life cycle your organization is in. And again, when you're doing that, focus on the organization and the different elements of your organization, not on individuals. And then from there, maybe reflect on what needs to happen in terms of individual or role-based characteristics and behaviors in order to make change successful at your life cycle stage, especially given some potential differences between different elements within your organization. So I really want to emphasize that, strength in management is influenced by a fit between the leadership attributes and the life cycle stage as well. So flesh out what leadership looks like across the board, and think again, as well as we heard many times earlier in this webinar, on how we can use those keys of collaboration and communication in order to bring people together and move forward as a team. Often what we see when it comes to change leadership and the different organizational life cycles is that change leaders are really able to identify their organizational life cycle stage and maybe some of the different stages that different elements will be at. They understand the resources, strategies, and risks involved in executing change at that stage. So as I mentioned earlier, when we think about maybe administrative systems having to take some strain with certain types of change, a successful change leader is going to be able to identify that right away and work collaboratively with those people to identify some strategies to accommodate that. They can anticipate some of the tensions that arise when moving between life cycle stages. So if you're looking to make a shift, let's say you're undergoing a major shift in your organizational priorities and with the expectation that this is going to turn around your organization, that might mean that people will shift in your organization. I know certainly in the example I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, when we had a major change to the structure of our board, we had a lot of renewal on the board when we moved to a new model. Certain people were really attached to the old way of doing things and didn't want to be part of a future that was different than the past. But at the same time, it opened the door to recruit some people that were new, that were a really great fit and could help us really enliven the new vision and the new focus of the board. And then finally, another element that successful change leaders execute is that they're really focused on fit when involving others and change management activities. And so they're thinking about where the different elements are, but they're also thinking maybe about the personalities and attributes of individuals as they want to bring them forward. So if we think about an organization that's undergoing a major turnaround, you want to recruit people to the team, whether it's key volunteers or committee members or board members that are excited by that kind of change because they are out there, and if you can frame the opportunity in that way, it will attract the people that are really keen on it. There are people who are motivated by change and really love to be at organizations in a place of uncertainty and to bring the organizations into a place of clarity. So they're out there. Don't be afraid to own it. Don't be afraid to name it. If you articulate it, people will meet you where you're at and help you get to where you want to go. Now we're going to move on and explore the final element of the AdCar model and what I consider to be sort of the secret sauce of successful change leadership, and that's reinforcement. So this is where you would focus on sustaining the momentum of change and engaging stakeholders in some evaluation, some learning, and some adaptation. So really continually focusing on maybe tweaking some of the changes that are happening, but also painting the picture of where are we now, where are we going, and are we getting close to our end goal. So with that, we need to start a conversation about transition versus change. And so this is where people really come into the fore. And what's going on at an individual level for people as they're experiencing change. And so in this section, if you're interested in reading more about it, there's a great book from an author named William Bridges called Managing Transitions. And William Bridges says, that change is situational. It's something that happens to people, even if they don't agree with it. And transition is psychological, and that happens internally. It happens in people's minds as they experience change. Another way of thinking about it is that change can be an event, right? It can happen with some sort of, let's say, change management exercise or programmatic change or personnel change. And transition is more of the process internally that happens afterwards. So there's probably a lot of examples that come to mind where change happened quickly, but transition happened more slowly. So you can maybe think about those. So that might be something that you want to take back to your team as well when you're thinking about this and maybe having those conversations about change or reflecting on it as well within your own organizations or examples where you've led change, where the change happens quickly and transition happens more slowly. What is the impact on the team? And how do you know what's really going on for other people? And so William Bridges charted it out like this. He said there's really 3 zones that people need to go through. There's sort of an ending phase where people are losing something and letting go. There's a neutral zone, which is kind of the in-between zone where there's chaos, there's uncertainty. People might feel disoriented, and there could be a high degree of concern around a risk of failing. And then that's followed by beginnings. So a new chapter, renewal, and feeling really excited about the way things are going to be. So I want to emphasize here that there's overlap, right? So these are not, really hard and fast, distinct phases. You can kind of move through them slowly, move through them in a way that may not be completely smooth, and that's fine. And everybody has their own journey as they move from the ending phase through the neutral zone to the new beginning. So let's look at these individually. So the first is the ending phase, and in the ending phase, people need to leave behind the old. And so there's almost some grieving or mourning that happens. So the key goal of this phase is to acknowledge that and accept that the old is going to fall away. So there could be grief or sadness, and that can be really difficult for people. And they may not always feel safe to acknowledge it, especially if they're working in a larger organization or even a team, that might be excited about the change. They might feel that if they're not on side with it right away, they might keep that to themselves, and that can cause some difficulty or discomfort with it. Then there's the neutral zone, and the key goal of this phase is to provide reassurance, to strengthen clarity and focus, and encourage innovation. And with the neutral zone, it's a question of that space between the old and the new, right? So there's some pretty big emotions here. People might feel frightened or confused, but there's also a positive set of emotions where people could see the opportunities for creativity and learning and cultivating new habits or experimenting. So what's really essential here is focusing on innovation and reinvention, redefinition, and reframing. People tend to spend a lot of time, the most time, in the neutral zone, where there is a high degree of uncertainty. And then within the neutral zone, you can really figure out what's going on for people, right? Is it that they're having a mix of emotions with the uncertainty and the excitement? Is one sort of outweighing the other? This quote on screen says that the neutral zone is an unpredictable place, and that's certainly the experience that a lot of people have, that there's opportunity, yet there's not necessarily comfort or confidence in how we can move forward or the timelines for moving forward. So there's some questions on screen that you might want to reflect on or bring forward to your next change leadership opportunity. As a leader, how comfortable are you in not knowing the answers? And how often do you seek out the perspectives of others? Those questions and that reflection can really help you to maybe empathize or relate to other people, especially when they're in the neutral zone. Then finally, we have new beginnings. And so with this stage comes a return of that degree of comfort and confidence and engagement. And the key goal of this phase is really to commit to the new and to be future focused. So most people, when they're in the new beginnings, they feel really good. It's kind of like spring weather coming back after a long winter. There's new understandings, there's some excitement, you'll see a shift maybe as well in people's body language and behaviors. So when you think about transitions, I'll encourage you on your own time to reflect on what kind of feelings you experience in each phase, in the ending, neutral, and beginning. Typically, according to the authors, in the ending phase, as we looked at it, there's fear, denial, a sense of loss, frustration, and disorientation. The neutral zone has sort of a mix of positive and more challenging emotions. There might be low morale and productivity. There might be skepticism. There might be resentment. There might also be some curiosity. There might also be some excitement or some potential, some flashes of positivity or hope in that moment. And then as we move to the new beginning, you'll notice a shift towards higher energy again, more openness, more curiosity and creativity, and a renewed commitment to the group. So I would encourage you again to, on your own, think about some of the experiences or best practices that have helped you as a change leader manage these spaces. So some things that we've heard here at Vantage Point is patience. And knowing, especially if you're working with a team, let's say you're working with a board in order to, and the board is looking to make some change. Not everyone is going to move through this change process and transition at the same pace. So you might have one-on-one conversations with some board members where they're feeling really excited and it's clear that they're in the new beginning. and you might have other board members that are in the ending phase or neutral zone. So it's really important not to be prescriptive, but to focus on listening first and focus on supporting people and collaboratively painting that picture again and again, if required, on what will come next and why we're motivated to make the change. If people are stuck in the neutral zone, you might need to go back to basics and get back to the change equation. What is it that we're trying to overcome here? What problem are we trying to fix? What's the vision for the future? And what are our next steps? And breaking it down in that way can be really helpful for people because it takes it from a place of feeling uncertain and murky back to a place of feeling really clear and positive. Some strategies as well that the authors suggest for each of the phases that might be helpful. For that ending phase, it's starting from a place of honoring past successes and contributions. A lot of people can feel very threatened because it's during change because it challenges the way that they've done things and the contributions that they might have made to the process. So clarifying what's ending and what's not can help. Acknowledging the feelings of loss and naming that uncomfortable feeling can be really helpful as well. And then, again, focusing on that problem, that motivation. Here's why we're trying to change. Here's the problem that we're trying to overcome without discrediting the past can be really positive. And if you can do that in a depersonalized way, it's even more successful. And here I would just emphasize just a word of advice. Try and focus on the new, the big shining new. Focus most of your energy and attention on that rather than getting stuck on the past. For the neutral zone, some strategies that are really effective are encouraging creative and innovative suggestions, giving people some space to ask questions and maybe do some brainstorming, acknowledging that there are new approaches there, as well as some of the uncertainty that, maybe as a change leader, it feels or looks like you're in a place of a lot more control, but change affects everyone and transition is going on for you as well. So making sure people know that you're all in the same boat can be helpful, right? Minimizing additional changes, so focusing on the tasks at hand, and it can be helpful to make it feel more manageable, as well as creating short-term goals and short-term wins. So there's a suggestion earlier that it's important to keep track of the milestones along change, and that's absolutely imperative there. And finally, what's in it for me, or WIIFM, what's in it for me, can make it easier for people to get on board because it helps you think about things from their perspective and helps people to understand what the benefit is. And if they can work with you to identify that, it's even more powerful. And finally, some strategies for the new beginnings are to be really clear about the objectives, to know what you're gaining, take deliberate steps, solidify new skills, and just do it. So those are a lot of different strategies for the new beginnings. So if we break them down, being really clear about objectives gets back to that place of repetition. Being clear about what are our big picture goals with the change that we want to create, and what are the benefits. So that's a constant throughout the transition process. Back to the change equation, back to the motivation, back to the vision, and back to the next steps. Those steps should be deliberate, they should be concrete, and they should be manageable. They should feel bite-sized. So sometimes when people get really lost in change, it's because it's too big. It's too focused on the next, on the new beginnings, and it's too focused on the vision and not on the concrete bite-sized steps. So when you think about where people can get stuck, break it down into a smaller step. And if that's too much, break it down into an even smaller step. So when you think about someone who might want to have a change in their own life, let's say to become more physically active, and they identify a goal of joining a class where they can participate in ongoing activity, it might be that if it's brand new for them, they need to break it down into the different steps. Where am I going to find the class? How am I going to register? Do I have to make a phone call? Do I have to go there in person? Do I sign up online? Breaking it down into very, very concrete steps, especially when something is brand new, can be the most helpful. And it also, because it provides some clarity on what's expected, but it also makes it feel that you're moving forward by accomplishing all of those little steps one after another. And it also allows you to just focus on doing it. When something is as small as making one phone call, sending one email, it feels a lot more achievable than doing something brand new that you've never tried before. I'll highlight as well a case study that is in your workbook on a change that was really well designed and very poorly executed. And this change was for an organization that served parents and families and had some online registration goals. So they've noticed that they were spending a lot in in-person registration and wanted to move to an online registration system, and it failed miserably. I'll let you read in your workbooks the reasons why and identify, some of the changes that you would have made to this. But at a high level, you'll notice that people weren't engaged at the beginning. They weren't engaged in the middle. They were only really engaged at the end. So the change really happened without the first key steps of AdCar. There was no focus on the awareness or desire and of the need for change, and the middle steps of knowledge and ability were skipped over as well. There wasn't enough focus on training and empowerment and education of those who were directly involved, and so it wasn't a surprise at the end, looking back, that the change didn't accomplish its goals of bringing people towards a new vision of the future. So as you work through that and read that in your workbooks, I'll put these questions up on screen as well. They're also in your workbook, so you can have an opportunity to think about AdCar and think about what might be different if you were managing it with the knowledge that you have now. I want to close on a note that you always have to think about what's happening for other people and what those phases are like internally, and that can be challenging. So when you think about the people on your team that you're working with and the behaviors that show up for them, the emotions that they might be experiencing, some of it's very obvious or it can be observed, and some of it is very difficult to detect. So having ongoing communication and curiosity and openness is key. So as a change leader, reflect on these questions. What is changing and what's changing for who? What will actually be different because of the change, not only for you or the organization, but for the individuals that you work with? Who's going to lose what? Who's going to gain what? And what will be staying the same for people? And if you can do that at the level of each individual team member, having that confidential conversation that we heard about earlier from one of the examples, can make people feel empowered. It can shift it from a place of uncertainty and being in that neutral zone to, again, focusing on the new beginning. The last image I want to leave you with is this image of a marathon. And that's really what change leadership is for a few reasons. I really want to reinforce that leaders can acknowledge that the same event can yield a very different experience. So if you look at an example like this particular marathon, if you're at the beginning or the forefront, you know what's coming ahead because you can see it. And you can start anticipating, when the gun's going to go off, your muscles are primed, you're excited about it, and you're ready to go. But if you're halfway back, if you're, 200 or 300 meters back, you don't have the same perspective. You don't have the visibility on what's out in front. And you don't have the same cues, and it can feel like it takes more time to sort of warm up and get going. So when you think about where other people are, you're setting the pace for them, you're communicating the vision for them, and you're helping them stay motivated. So as a leader, remember that people are going to move through this at different paces in their own way, and providing support, connection, and motivation throughout the experience or event is really what will make the difference in a successful change leadership activity. So in close, I'll leave you with this question. What processes and tools are you going to employ to keep people engaged and transitioning towards change? Thank you to Gymnastics BC for the opportunity to be able to share some insights about change leadership and what works and what to be mindful of. So thank you so much, and thank you for taking part today.